Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar on social protection responses to COVID-19. Are we doing enough? I'm Asad Islam, a director of the Center for Development Economics and Sustainability. We begin as usual by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which our four Australian campuses stand and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So this webinar is hosted by the CDS at Monash Business School. It's part of our ongoing series, COVID-19 and beyond. And it is the 19th of this series. We started this in May to provide a forum for discussion on the huge economic and social ramification of the pandemic and evolving policy responses that are coming in both developing and developed countries. The social protection, broadly speaking, includes safety nets, social assistance, job security, unemployment benefit and insurance to support people's lives and livelihood. We all know that this COVID-19 gave us an unprecedented challenge in terms of protecting people's life and livelihood, and especially countries around the world needed to take different degrees of lockdown measures, social distancing measures, and the reserves economy aspects also were affected, and the government needed to step up in terms of protecting people's health and livelihood. But we also know that developing countries in particular do not have that much capacity to protect their own people because of limited resources available. Despite that, many developing countries during this time took very unusual steps to protect the peoples in terms of improving their food security situation and also protecting people from the virus. We will hear a lot from our speakers today. They will give their in-depth overview and discussion. So before I go with our speaker, I'll just start with some numbers. Few slides, just if I can share my screen. So it seems that my screen is not coming in. Anyway, it seems that developing countries and developed countries are differing in terms of the protection measures that they took in response to COVID-19. So countries like Bangladesh took only 4% of its GDP as a stimulus package, and whereas in India we see about 15% of its GDP is spent on COVID-19 related measures. In developed countries, the measures are more broad-based, and also countries like Japan spent about 70%. In Australia, where we see about 27% of the GDP is spent on people's livelihood and things. So, as part of our efforts to understand the livelihoods, we also did some fieldwork in Bangladesh to understand the food security and other situations. And what we find is that 90% of the people have lost their income, partially or fully, and people who lost their income are more concerned about their finances, and people who are able to cope with income loss are also more concerned about the health issues. So it seems that protecting health means also protecting also their people's livelihood. Otherwise, the health and issue will not be solved. And we also observed that in terms of providing a stimulus package in Bangladesh, even 3 months after the lockdown was over, we see that the stimulus did not reach to the farms, the people who need it the most. So there is issue in terms of both targeting this transfers and also the providing adequate transfers when people need it the most. So we will hear a lot about these issues, about what are the best policy options in terms of targeting this transfer in times of this crisis. We are delighted to have these three speakers. I'll briefly introduce them. Our speakers include Celia Reyes. Celia is now currently the president of the Philippines Institute of Development Studies and director of the Community-Based Monitoring System Network. Celia was co-director of the Poverty and Economic Policy Network, PEP, and also director of the PEP CBA and Research Program. Celia was also president of the Philippines Economic Society, chairperson of the Technical Committee on Poverty Statistics, and advisor to a range of national government technical working groups on poverty monitoring and indicator system in the Philippines. Second speaker is Mihail Rutisky. Mihail is currently the Global Director of Social Protection and Jobs, overseeing the World Bank's work on developing systems that protect the poorest and vulnerable from crisis and shocks and supporting private sector-led growth. Until 2016, Mihail was the director of multilateral organization, and before that, country director of the Russian Federation and resident representative in Moscow for 3 years. Last speaker is Sudarno Somarto. Sudarno is currently the director of the Ismail Research Institute in Indonesia. He is also a policy advisor of the national team for the acceleration of poverty reduction of the Vice President Office in Indonesia. He is a former head of the Statistics Society Forum in Indonesia and has been a visiting fellow at the Southeast Asia Forum at Stanford University. He has done extensive work in the field, including randomized control trial, targeting issues, transfer issues, and including work with Abhijit Banerjee and people in Jepal, Ben Olken, and Remahana. So we will hear from our speakers. Before that, I just wanted to mention that today's discussion will be followed by a question and answer session from the audience. So please ask your question in the Q&A function of the Zoom at any time during the proceedings, and we will get back after the speakers present their initial thoughts on these issues, and we'll try to cover as much as possible. So with this, I would now ask Mihail to start his presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon and good evening. I suspect most of you are in a good morning phase. I think we agreed with our colleague Shahab that he will be showing my presentation. So I see him sharing the screen, and this is indeed the title of the seminar today, very well chosen title, a question whether we are doing enough. I think is actually very well posed question. Next slide, please. I think before we even try to answer the question whether we are doing enough, it is important to take a picture of what was happening before COVID hit us. And here I present to you a graph that gives you a picture of what social safety nets, the most popular part of the social protection system, otherwise known as social assistance. We use terms social safety nets and social assistance interchangeably, and that refers to non-contributory benefits, which are focused on those who are in need. And what does it mean to be in need is obviously a separate issue. I will comment on social insurance later and labor market policies, but now I am focusing on social safety nets. So you would see that before COVID, essentially we had a situation where in all population, the coverage was at the level of actually more than 50% in lower middle income countries, but less than 50% in upper middle income countries. The abbreviations in the bottom, LIC means low income countries, LMIC means low and middle income countries, UMIC means upper and middle income countries or upper middle income countries. And then what we do, and we always do that, as in the World Bank, we focus so much on whether we reach the poorest and most vulnerable. You get in gray all population coverage, and then you have bottom 20%. You would expect that bottom 20% benefits much more than all population, but already I think this glance at the picture shows you that it's not necessarily the case, other than in upper middle income countries, because for various reasons related to both the concept of universal benefits, subsidies to energy, subsidies to food, as well as to poor targeting, that is not necessarily the case. So in low-income countries before COVID, more people, higher percentage of people benefited from safety nets among the total population than among those who are in bottom 20%. And then on the right-hand side, you have the headline numbers on spending on safety nets as a percentage of GDP, and then the share of safety nets in transfers for those who are poor, and we define the poor here as less than $1.9 per day, and then average number of programs introduced in Africa, our main partner, given the poverty there, per year. That's the snapshot of what was there before COVID. Next slide, please. Thank you very much, Shahab. And the scale up was absolutely unprecedented. We cannot find a historic comparator to that particular scale up. And here, I think I'm just showing you the numbers as a percentage of GDP. And we are doing a comparison here of two crises, the 2020 crisis, the current one, the COVID related, and then 2008, 2009. And as you would see, the current response in terms of the average stimulus package, I am talking here about social protection measures and all other measures, of which many have relation to social protection because they are often, especially in upper middle income countries, related to jobs and related to preserving financing when the jobs cannot be properly done. But it's more than twice what happened in 2008 and 2009. And I would also add to that if we just look at social protection measures, they are higher in 2020 crisis than they were in 28-29 crisis. So both the overall package is higher, it's actually much higher, but social protection part is also higher. Next slide, please. And here we have actually a sort of timeline of reactions. And we go March, April, May, you would recognize the points on the left-hand side. And what we count here on the left-hand side are how many countries did something. And we count, last time we counted, it's 212 countries did something. And then we also went to a granular level to look at each and every measure and looked at what was altered, meaning something scaled up or a new program created. And then we have this number of 1,179 measures. And then when you look at this huge block of social protection measures, it's useful to have some sense of how they divide up among different buckets. And the buckets, and you have it on the right hand side when you have different color coding, as you would not be surprised that social assistance, which is AKA social safety nets, totally dominate the picture. Last resort measure, people falling in incomes and livelihoods into poverty, or not falling into poverty, but falling in income and livelihoods. So it absolutely dominates the picture, especially in low income countries. You see the gray bars being so big. it's worth noticing that also you have here, you have the social insurance measures and labor markets measures. Labor market measures, not surprisingly, grow as you go along the income level, as the labor income measures in terms of protecting income of those who couldn't work were particularly pronounced in higher income countries. And so this is one distinction is between social assistance, social insurance, and labor markets. You see how social assistance, social safety nets dominate the picture. And then also we also try in this slide to show you the distinction between when cash was the main medium of providing assistance and when it was done through in-kind measures focused on food security and nutrition. Next slide, please. And in the next slide, which is busy, but I think it is understandable, we have three measures which I'd like to share with you. And those three measures are the measures of adequacy, of scale up, and of cash coverage. And I think what is really pertinent here is to realize that the increase in adequacy is defined as a percentage difference between current COVID-related cash transfer value versus most recent value in pre-COVID levels. And this is as per, we have a big database in the World Bank called Aspire, in actually my global practice of social protection and jobs. So the recent value in pre-COVID levels is compared to the current COVID-related cash transfers value in percentage terms, and this is what you have under the first measure, that is adequacy. And then we also compare the increase in coverage, defined as a percentage difference between current COVID-related cash transfer coverage, and coverage is a percentage of people covered in the numerator versus population in the denominator, versus most recent coverage level in pre-COVID levels as per our database I just referred to. So I think there is a huge variance here. I think it's useful to focus on averages, like global average or in cash coverage being 17%, which are all huge increases, unprecedented increases. I only gave you a comparison with 2008 crisis, but even when we look, although not as thoroughly at previous crises, this is an enormous scale up. Next slide, please. And here in this slide, you actually could get a bit into more retail level in terms of rounds of expansion, because what this slide shows, it actually compares the planned coverage of measures with actual coverage. And you would have here in that, for instance, in the programs that were initially created and implemented for a few months, got the second round in which the countries realized that the COVID crisis is more lasting than we thought. And therefore, in the second round expansion, they needed to expand those programs. And then you would see how the ambitions compare with reality. In gray, you have planned coverage, and in dark, you have the actual coverage of various programs. These are actually actual cash transfer programs. And you would see a huge ambitions, and those ambitions are largely met with some exceptions in terms of how coverage expanded. Next slide, please. And now there is a big debate going on. What are the best predictor of success? Meaning that you can expand the social safety net, the cash transfers program, and make sure that those programs end up in the hands of right recipients. And one of the best indicators, the best predictors of success is delivery capacity, which is portrayed in this graph. The delivery capacity in this graph is a very specific. It uses what is called the GEM index. You have, if you look at the x-axis underneath, you have a GEM index defined there. What is the GEM index? The GEM index is not the World Bank invention. It's an invention of the Center for Global Development in Washington. the institution, the sister institution, it's not really sister, but the think tank around, which essentially defined the capacity of countries to roll out successful social assistance programs as being dependent upon sound identity systems that you can identify the individual, mobile phones coverage, and then bank accounts. The financial inclusion, those of you who are of Indian or South Asian descent would recognize that the JAM comes from the Indian definition, in which A stands for Aadhaar, which is the identification, in which M stands for mobile money, mobile phones, and J stands for financial inclusion. And then you here would see the correlation between the ability to increase cash transfer coverage and the JAM index, however crude the measure is of the delivery capacity. Next slide, please, so that I could end on time. There are big buts, and the buts, many of them relate to the one-off nature of programs. And then here you have a comparison of the fact that 29% of those programs are actually meant to be one-off, sometimes rightly so, and we claim very often rightly so in upper middle income countries, less so in low income countries when the coverage gap was big. The average duration of anything special is only 3.3 months. And then the spending, if you look per capita, spendings are just and up at $4 net. Next slide, please. And I think I come to the conclusion, trying to finish as scheduled within next 2 minutes. I think what I want to conclude is with the lessons which we draw by now from the COVID crisis for social protection, and it will be redefining the question, are we doing enough, into whether are we doing the right things, or what should we focus on as we move ahead. And I would claim that first and foremost, rather than thinking in terms of scaling up and doing more, we need to focus on adaptive social protection systems, meaning the ability of the systems when the crisis hits to scale up and scale down flexibly as needed. And already before COVID, we knew that the severity and the number of shocks, by which I mean climate change shocks, but also man-made shocks and all kinds in between, like however you want to define the COVID shock, whether it's man-made or not, it's a matter of discussion, I guess, and not for us maybe. But the point is, the severity and the frequency has been going up. The COVID only emphasizes it. And that is a big call for social protection institutions in all countries to work together with humanitarian institutions. Too often we see two separate circles. There is a humanitarian circle of assistance which doesn't speak to the social protection systems. Instead, we would like to have a system that scales up and down and doesn't use two separate tracks. The second conclusion from COVID is that we need to rethink the way we think about targeting. At least in the World Bank, we always thought of targeting in terms of the poorest and the most vulnerable first. I think it's a sound principle, but and we call it progressive universalism. But when shocks come, you need to factor in other things like the biggest losers, and also more complicated political calculation in terms of who you need to support for the reasons of their social capital and influence on others, which complicates the picture of targeting. I would rather use the term prioritization than targeting, but to be linked to the tradition, I say targeting, but that needs to be rethink. This third lesson, which I think is very important, is that in many countries what we see, those cash transfers I talked about need to be accompanied by other measures. And here I'm referring to the famous graduation agenda coming of Bangladesh in the 70s, coaching, mentoring, asset transfer, because very often in order to be successful, cash is not enough. It needs to be cash plus. It wasn't covered by my slides, but we are now zooming into particular cases. And we see when plus element is well used, the cash transfer, the social safety nets is far more successful. And my two final points are that we see a big depletion of social insurance resources. One is simply a depletion of the budgetary funds for COVID response, which means that in pay-as-you-go systems, you have less resources. But we also have a very straight dispersion of pension funds when they accumulated revenues. And there is no clear plan how you bring them back to being sound and be able to deliver on old age security. So social insurance become a big call to think of as we think of the consequences of COVID, because a significant part of that was used for COVID response. And my very final point is also a quite fundamental point, which is that COVID actually emphasized and accentuated something which we saw before, which is that there is a changing nature of work, with people changing what they do much more frequently and having very fluid relations with the labor market. In developed countries, it was seen through Uberization, Airbnbization, and all the flexible forms, which we see increasing very quickly. And in developing world, it was emphasized by the lack of formalization. India, if I may, was 90% informal 50 years ago, is 90% informal now. Nothing progressed. So we need to build social protection systems that are independent from the formal employment status. And that's needed for different reasons, for high-income countries and for low-income countries. And it actually, in terms of the immediate consequences, it actually calls upon separating social protection system from payroll taxes. For two reasons. Payroll taxes are less and less relevant in the developed world if people do not have payroll, but they are self-employed, then they migrate, then they are contracted out. They are in all kinds of relationship with the labor market, but payroll is not a part of that. How would payroll tax would be the appropriate way of financing it? We need to go for the broadest possible tax base, not for payroll tax. And in developing countries, traditionally from Bismarck times, payroll tax was selected only because it was the most observable. But look at Kenya. In Kenya, payroll tax is 9% of the economy, but mobile money transaction could be observed in 80% of the economy. So there is a big revolutionary call for social protection to move from the traditional reliance on payroll tax as the countries progress along the economic development ladder to really rethinking it and think in terms of the broadest tax-based and the proper reaction to the fluidity of the relationship with the labor market, which will only be accentuated by COVID that disturbs so many lives, and it really calls on helping people for change in transition between jobs rather than to help them to stay within existing jobs and in existing situations. Thank you very much for the invitation, that I am very honored to have a chance to address you in this conference. Over.
Thank you, Michael. That was very nice overview of what is happening in the world in terms of the social protection measures. And we see there is divergence in developing and developed countries. We see there are issues in terms of delivery mechanisms and how we actually target them. So we will hear more from Darno. I think he has ground experience about targeting transfer system and has done a lot of research. With this, I will move to now Darno.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Greeting from Jakarta and also from Marang. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Arsak for kindly inviting me to this webinar series. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and thanks for your help to put my presentation on the screen today. And I would like to use this opportunity to talk about Indonesia's social protection system amidst the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. So in the next 15 minutes, I will discuss about how's the economy affected by the COVID-19 and what the government has been responded and what lesson that we can draw from this COVID-19 and beyond. Next, please. So the first question is, I would like to begin by setting the state. How has the COVID-19 affected Indonesia's economy? The economic crisis brought by COVID-19 is the worst hit experienced by Indonesia, I believe also many other countries in the past 50 years since the 1998 financial crisis. In the first quarter of 2020, as you can see from the right chart, Indonesian economy still grew actually about 3%. But by the second quarter of 2020, our economy contracted by minus 5.23%. All sectors were contracted with the exception of agriculture. But the role of agriculture has declined since the 1998 crisis. However, compared to the 1998, Indonesia now has a better economic structure and social protection system is already in place, even though not perfect. And the good news is that the third quarter, you can see from the very right of this chart, Indonesia's economic growth has shown some sign of recovery. So we are expecting a V type of recovery, inshallah, and mostly driven by government expenditure that grew almost 10%. To be exact, about 9.76%. Next, please. So how does the pandemic affect poverty? Poverty went up due to the pandemic, but it's not as bad as it did in 98, where the poverty almost doubled in the middle of the chart, from about 13% to 24%. Amid this pandemic, the Indonesian poverty rate increased by about 0.4 percentage point, from 9.41 in March 2019 to about 9.80% or 9.78% in March 2020. This figure means that there are additional 1.3 million new poor people. And this has wiped out our effort in reducing poverty for the last 2 years. We still do not have the September 2020 numbers from SUSNAS, a nationally representative household survey, where the poverty number is based on. But most likely, the poverty increase will be much higher than the increase in March 2020. Next, please. Safety nets and safety ropes are key in dealing with the pandemic. So this is the term that I echo with Len Pritchard when he was still with the World Bank in 1998. The term safety ropes. While social assistance play a key role in mitigating the pandemics based on social safety net, but we also expand the safety rope. Safety net program was mentioned, they aim to target those who are poor and also slightly above the poverty line, while the safety ropes are intended to provide transfer to those whose income have fallen, not necessarily falling under the poverty threshold. As we all know that during the economic growth, social assistance can increase household demand and speed up economic recovery instead of monetary policy or tax incentive, for example. And these are what the government of Indonesia is currently doing by focusing on the provision of and distribution of social assistance and expanding that program to the middle class. Next, please. And I would like to talk about the many programs that has been put in place to mitigate the pandemic's impact in terms of the size and the size of the benefit as well as the targeting mechanism. So with the fiscal expansion, various existing social safety net and safety rope has been expanded in terms of the scope and also benefit. The left of this chart, of this table, we can see that the government expanded the existing program before the COVID-19, like the cash transfer program, the conditional one increased by about 800,000 families, and the benefit has been increased to about 25%. The staple food program, called the Sembako program, previously rice distribution, increased by about 5 million families, and the benefit has been increased to about 25%. Government also introduced this electricity subsidy, free of charge for close to 32 million, to be exact 31.1 million for those having 450 PA, and also partial subsidy for relatively higher income later to having 900 PA. As with the additional new program from the regular one, the government also introduced the so-called pre-employment card in terms of the targeting. This is an on-demand application, self-targeted program, not only to give a cash transfer, but also to encourage and also to require the beneficiaries to enroll in online training to improve their skill. Government also used the mean testing using those having formal salary less than 5 million a month, working in the formal sector, covering almost 16 million individuals. giving 600,000, close to about $55 US per month for about 4 months. Another innovation, government also used the community-based targeting approach by, in the past, government already distributed money in the village up to about billion rupiah per year. In the past, the money has been used for infrastructure and also the building school and road, improving road. Now that money can only be used for helping families who are not receiving other program, and the targeting is done through the community and with the leadership of the village leader and also local community leaders. So this is the right mix of the targeting mechanism using community and then social registry as well as mean testing of their salaries. Next. So we learn a lot from this COVID-19 as we go along. So what have we learned from the Indonesian social protection amid this pandemic? While our system has improved since the 1998 crisis, the COVID-19 has also acted as a pressure test that highlights the shortcoming in the social protection system that have been stymied its ability to fully weather the storm. At least we identified 2 cracks on the system. The first one is on the our targeting mechanic. Our social registry, or we call it TTKS, was last updated about 5 years ago. So it lacks dynamic, and as a result, we found exclusion and inclusion error in the system. And we have to admit that our systems are also very highly centralized, and this will not allow local to respond and giving flexibility to reaching out the new poor caused by the crisis, especially during this COVID-19. Next. Through ad hoc program designed to complement the existing social system, Indonesia was able to reach most of the bottom 40%. Both those recorded in the social registry that I just mentioned, the TTKS, and also those who missed and even expanded to the middle income. The government has increased the budget for social assistance from about 135 trillion, about 0.85% of GDP before the COVID-19. This is around 10 billion US dollar, mostly, to about 250 trillion, or 1.57% of GDP. This is exactly the previous speaker talked about the average of social assistance during the pandemic is about 1.5%. This means that the social system has been, in the budget, has been doubled by the government. However, we also learned that this social system program in terms of the size were still not sufficient to maintain the beneficiaries' families' consumption level, simply because the shock were far too deep. For example, if the family only received the food stamp program, actually it needs additional about $30 per month to keep their consumption level as before the COVID-19. So this is the issue that we have been discussing a lot during the deliberation, but because of budget issues at the beginning, and also it has to go through many bureaucratic process. So actually it has been increased, but maybe still not enough. Next, please. So I would like to identify some challenges. That the pandemic was a wake-up call, highlighting the importance of tackling existing problems that we are facing. And it's also, it has brought new challenges for Indonesia. And any reform has to address at least 4 things that we can identify, that we are also at risk of losing 2 decades of progress as people lose skill, children drop out of school, and also experience malnutrition. This has been revealed by the high-frequency study by the bank that close to 70% of families reduce their consumption, food especially during the pandemic. We are also living in the changing world that Indonesia's social protection need to evolve and into a broader recovery program, not only to build back to the same economy, but also to the change market, such as digital transformation, expansion in e-commerce, online teaching, and fintech. We also have to prepare for future storm. This is similar to what the previous speaker, Michael, said about the flexible social protection that can be expanded when the crisis, because this kind of crisis is chronic and will recur. And Indonesia in 20 years from now are also facing an aging population, and the reform have to prepare for this in the future. Next. Thank you. So I would like to talk about what the opportunity that we can draw from this one. So this is a very daunting task, but we have to also address the future challenges for Indonesia. Although outdated, the Indonesian Social Registry, or TTKS, as a targeting instrument is not that insufficient actually. Despite its imperfection, Indonesia is on the right tracks and targeted benefit is more cost effective. This is based on the compared to universal coverage based on the paper by my colleague from MIT and Harvard, Dimahana and Van Olken. So going forward, Indonesia will develop a dynamic social registry to ensure that data is always up to date for greater accuracy and efficiency. Today, Indonesia is also experimented with complementary social protection programs such as the village cash transfer and also on-demand programs such as the pre-employment card. What Indonesia needs to do as it goes forward is to take a note on what works and what will be improved. And most importantly is to seek a program mix that works in the face of future challenges. Next, please, thank you. As I said at the previous slide, even though Indonesia is moving in the right direction to build a quality human capital through social protection, so there's been a great understanding in the policymakers that social protection is not a cost, but it's an investment for future generation. But Indonesia is still in the early stages for building a comprehensive system. It is still incomplete, both structural and also mainly institutional. So we identified at least 6 issues that need to be addressed in the future. Again, that we have to have this dynamic social registry so that we can reduce our exclusion and inclusion error, and the benefit can be dispersed more accurately and efficiently. We also have to realize our promise, it's already in the law, of universal health coverage, so that it will protect Indonesian people throughout their life. It doesn't mean that everybody has to be covered by the government. Government already subsidized those in the bottom 40%, but there are a lot of missing middle who actually are able to buy insurance, but they didn't do so. So we need to incentivize them based on the study that been doing with Abhijit and also Amy Frankenstein of MIT, that actually there is a way to encourage people to participate in the insurance, health insurance. We'll share the paper if you're interested, still under review. And we also have to protect vulnerable groups and managing long-term impact, especially including elderly and people with disability to mitigate the long-term impact, including the COVID-19. We also need to have a flexible system that will give up room for policymakers to expand during major shocks like pandemic. This is exactly like what Michael mentioned in his closing remark. And importantly, we also need to develop a pathway to independence. There's been a lot of critical, a lot of critics of the social protection system that we only gave the face, not the faceful. So we have to address that by, integrated social protection program with more livelihood, fostering economic and financial independence, such as improvement to access to microcredit, access to markets, so that poor welfare improvement could be sustainable in the future. And last but not least, we have to engage more with the local leaders, local actors, local community. The fact that the cash transfer, village cash transfer work really well, address the elderly, address the female-headed households, shows that there is capacity there that we need to encourage and work together. And finally, my last slide, I would like to throw 2 takeaways messages from this presentation. Despite improvement in the Indonesian social protection system in the past 2 decades, the pandemic has revealed cracks in it, we have to admit. Instead of treating the pandemic as a setback, this crisis served as an opportunity to hasten Indonesia's social protection system reform. And the government is already in line with that if you look at the budget for 2021. However, in implementing this much needed reform, besides future trend in urbanization and in aging population, Indonesia's social protection systems will also address problems brought about by the crisis, such as the loss in learning. I didn't mention in my talk of the loss in learning, but I can respond to your question if any. But basically, now a lot of kids, children of Indonesia, learning from school, learning from home, and this create a lot of issues in terms of the quality of our kid in the future. With that, I would end my talk, and thanks again, Professor Asad, for the invitation, and colleague from the CDES. My good friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dano. That was a very excellent presentation on what is happening in Indonesia in terms of targeting and transfer system. It seems that we have a lot to learn from Indonesia, especially building up a social registry system and also targeting the different programs and reaching out to the poor and vulnerable people, especially in times of things like this pandemic. So we will hear more from you in the Q&A sessions. I'm very much keen to hear from Celia what is happening in Philippines, where we have this kind of situation that I see that recently going through some other disaster as well. So we'll hear from Celia. Thank you, Celia.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. I'd like to thank the Center for Development Economics and Sustainability of Monash University for inviting me. And today I'll talk about social protection in the Philippines in the context of COVID-19 crisis. I will focus primarily on some of the safety nets that we have implemented in the Philippines. Safety nets are programs that address effects of economic shocks, disasters, and calamities, in this case, the COVID-19 pandemic, on specific vulnerable groups. I will talk about the status of COVID-19 pandemic around the world in the Philippines, impacts of the pandemic, specifically the effects on the economy, employment, and incomes. I'll discuss some of the social protection measures that have been implemented and moving forward, some potential courses of action. Let me present briefly the status of COVID-19. The year 2020 has been extraordinary. As of November 15, 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic has spread in 220 countries and territories and infected over 54 million persons with over 1 million deaths. Asia has the most number of cases at over 15 million, followed by Europe at 13 million, Latin America at 12 million, and Northern America at 11 million, while Latin America and the Caribbean recorded the highest cumulative deaths. Philippines is the second highest number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Southeast Asia, next to Indonesia, at over 400,000 cases as of November 14. Let me now turn to the impacts of the pandemic. With the pandemic still raging, analysts expect that the economies would continue to experience the negative impacts during the second semester of 2020, but tapering off as the economies reopen. The World Bank estimates that the global economy will contract by 5.2% in 2020. Only East Asia and the Pacific is forecasted to post positive growth in 2020, owing mainly to the positive growth of China. In 2020, when vaccine is assumed to be available, many of the economies are expected to recover, although not still to the pre-COVID level. In the Philippines, the GDP data for the third quarter show a slight improvement compared to the economic performance during the second quarter, when the Philippine economy contracted by 16% relative to the same quarter last year. The Philippine economy declined by 11.5% during the third quarter, as the country continues to impose some quarantine measures to contain the virus. Hardest hit were the accommodation and food service activities and other services sector, which contracted by 52.7% and 53.4% respectively. This was followed by construction, transportation and storage, real estate, and education. A few sectors posted positive growth. Public administration and defense posted 4.5% growth as there were no layoffs in government. Financial and insurance activities increased at 6.2% as people relied on e-commerce during the quarantine. Agriculture grew by 1.2% as the rural areas were not as affected by the community quarantines as much as the urban areas. With the easing of the quarantine status in the third quarter, mobility among workers increased. Employment rate picked up at 90% this July, compared to the record low of 82.3% in April 2020. However, it remains lower than the employment rate of 94.6% in the same month a year ago. About 41.3 million Filipinos were employed in July 2020, 42.5 million in July 2019, and 33.8 million in April 2020. On average, employed persons work 38 hours per week in July 2020, lower than the 41.8 hours per week in July 2019, but an improvement from the April 2020 estimated average of 35 hours per week. With the economy forced to shut down during the first few months of the pandemic, there has been a rapid increase in unemployment and underemployment in the country. Although most parts of the country has eased mobility restrictions, 5 regions still reported double-digit unemployment rates, including Metro Manila, Calabarzon, and Central Luzon, which generates about 3/5 of gross domestic output. Given the current trajectory of the economy, it's possible that the economy will contract by 9% for the whole year of 2020. We use this GDP assumption to simulate the impacts on poverty. The simulation results suggest that around 1.45 million families, covering about 7.53 million individuals, will become poor as a result of the pandemic. The Social Amelioration Program, the cash transfer program implemented by the government, reduces the number of new poor to 410,000 families or 2.82 million individuals. SAP, this is what we call our Social Amelioration Program, provides a cash assistance ranging from 5,000 pesos to 8,000 pesos. That's equivalent to about $100 to $160, depending on the region where the household is located, and this is given twice. The simulations suggest that the COVID-19 pandemic will increase the number of poor, but social protection in the form of SAP will temporarily help the families to smooth consumption. Since the SAP is temporary, other measures such as wage subsidies to firms or low-interest loans are needed to enable those who lost their jobs or closed their businesses to bounce back from the crisis. If they do not recover quickly, the new poor can become part of the chronic poor. The new poor may also adopt coping mechanisms that may have adverse impact on other dimensions of welfare. For instance, some of the new poor may withdraw their children from school, and this would have longer-term implications on the welfare of the household. Therefore, it's important to ensure that the recovery process for the economy is inclusive. To protect children, schools were closed in many countries in April, including the Philippines. Since then, many have adopted different modalities for education to continue. In the Philippines, children were allowed to go to school, and distance learning for basic education has been adopted were not allowed to go to school, and distance learning for basic education has been adopted by the Department of Education, while online and offline modes were offered to tertiary education. Total enrollment in the current school year was only 90% of the enrollment in the previous school year. Moreover, enrollment in private schools declined by almost half. This shows the impact of the pandemic, as parents either withdrew their children from school or transferred them from private to public schools. Let me now discuss some of the social protection programs that were implemented by the Philippine government. The government responded by realigning the budget towards programs to address the adverse impacts of the pandemic. It enacted fiscal stimulus packages. Bayanihan 1, that's what we call Bayanihan to Heal as One Act, was enacted in March 2020, granting the President additional authority to combat the COVID-19 pandemic with a fiscal stimulus package of about 360 billion pesos. This was followed by Bayanihan to Recover as One Act, enacted in September 2020, also called Bayanihan 2. It includes a 140 billion aid package for industries affected by the pandemic and a 25 billion standby fund that the government may spend before the 2021 budget takes effect. Altogether, the total of Bayanihan 1 and 2, plus an additional amount of about 7.5 billion, totaled 481 billion pesos. The national government, in coordination with local government units and other stakeholders, have implemented various policies and assistance programs to reduce the adverse impact of COVID-19 and the quarantine, particularly in terms of income and employment. Cash assistance amounting to 5,000 to 800,000 through the Social Amelioration Program or Emergency Subsidy Program was designed to be provided to a total of 18 million low-income families. There's also the COVID-19 Adjustment Measures Program of the Department of Labor and Employment and the Rice Farmer Financial Assistance Program of the Department of Agriculture, providing 5,000 pesos to affected formal sector workers and smallholder rice farmers, respectively. Grants and loans may also be availed by marginalized small farmers and fishers through the Survival and Recovery Assistance Program, while medium and small enterprises may avail loans through the Pondo para sa Pagbabago at Pag-asenso program. Emergency calamity loan assistance to private sector employees are also provided by the Social Security system. There are also in-kind assistance in the form of free transportation and distributed food packs and agricultural products. Meanwhile, displaced workers may be provided with temporary employment through the DUPAD program of the Department of Labor and Employment. The cash assistance programs of the national government include the Social Amelioration Program for low-income households, assistance for formal workers, assistance for displaced overseas Filipino workers, and financial assistance for rice farmers. SAP is the biggest program with 18 million target beneficiary households and a budget of close to 200 billion, or about 184 billion. Let me focus on this one, as the challenges of this program are also faced by the other programs. What are the features of the Social Amelioration Program, or SAP? First, target beneficiaries are poor families, including recipients of our conditional cash transfer program, informal economy workers, and those belonging to vulnerable sectors, namely senior citizens, persons with disability, pregnant and lactating women, solo parents, overseas Filipinos in distress, and indigent indigenous peoples. Looking at this list, it's apparent that a major challenge will be in identifying and locating these target beneficiaries. We have about 3 million poor families and 8 million low-income families before COVID, and the program is targeting 18 million out of the total of 24.8 million families. This represents almost 3/4 of the total number of families. By the way, we also have about 4.4 million families in our conditional cash transfer program. Second, financial assistance amounting to a minimum of 5,000 and a maximum of 8,000 pesos will be provided for 2 months. This is intended to smooth consumption of foods, medicines, and toiletries, as people were not able to work due to the lockdown. There were delays in the release of the payments due to operational challenges, identifying and locating the eligible beneficiaries, and the modality of payments. Some were coursed through the ATMs of the CCT beneficiaries, but many also had to get their assistance in cash. Take note also that the number of beneficiaries for the second tranche is only 14 million, lower than the 18 million for the first tranche. The reasons for the decline are some were found to be duplicates or ineligible, while some voluntarily returned the assistance. Social protection needs to be an integral component of the economic recovery plans, as a component of fiscal stimulus that can boost aggregate demand and support the economy to bounce back. Our total COVID response package is estimated to be 5.8% of our 2019 GDP, 7th among the ASEAN countries. On a per capita basis, we also rank 7th. The question is this enough? Considering that we will lose about 1.8 trillion pesos in GDP, equivalent to about 9% of GDP, some would argue that we could have spent more to somehow soften the sharp contraction of the economy. COVID-19 will not be gone by the end of the year. A vaccine is expected to be approved soon, but it will take months before the general population will be able to get it. We'll have to live with COVID-19 in the meantime. And not only a health crisis, but there will be other shocks, both natural and man-made, that we can expect. In fact, just last week, we were visited by strong typhoons, and the losses were also very significant. So how do we move forward? Some of the things we need to do are better program targeting. We need data for better targeting, monitoring, and implementation of government programs to ensure that assistance is delivered in a timely and equitable manner. We also need to look at the recovery package. The focus should be on inclusive recovery so that even the poor and small businesses can recover faster. This would require some programs to assist micro, small, and medium enterprises. Another important component would be the universal health insurance. We need to provide wider coverage and greater benefits, including testing for COVID-19 and vaccination. Targeted interventions will continue to be pursued given the limited financial resources of the country. In this regard, let me highlight some of the challenges and ways to address these challenges. As we have seen in some of the programs, major challenge was the difficulty in identifying the eligible beneficiaries. But what we also found was that data can be found from different government administrative databases and registries. Unfortunately, at this time, data are not being the use of this data are not being maximized. And what has been lacking was interoperable information systems. So this is one area that we need to focus on to make sure that we can maximize the use of information from these different agencies. More recently, the community-based monitoring system, which we have developed, has actually been adopted and institutionalized. And this is actually a monitoring system that's being undertaken by local government units. And this can provide the much needed data to facilitate targeting and also to facilitate the engagement of the local governments in the provision of social assistance and safety nets. I think another important component is the use of technology in the delivery of services. Digital ID that is being rolled out now will allow for easier verification of beneficiaries. Moreover, use of digital payments for government transactions will allow for faster delivery of assistance. Use of technology for delivery of social services, for instance, in health, in education, can promote equitable access. Those in the remote areas can be reached using telehealth or online education. But digital infrastructure has to be improved to address the digital divide. Otherwise, this could lead to greater inequality. We find in the Philippines, and perhaps this is also the case, that the poor and low-income groups have lower access to computers and internet. And finally, to conclude, the Philippine government has implemented several social protection programs to address the adverse impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. These programs, particularly the Social Amelioration Program, has helped many families avoid falling into or deeper into poverty. But these are temporary in nature. This will not help the families recover quickly, but merely help them smooth consumption. Improvements in the design and implementation of social protection programs have to be done as part of the Building Back Better plan. This way, we are ready to cope better with future shocks. Thank you.
Thank you, Saleha. That is very interesting presentation, especially focusing on the need for evidence-based solution in terms of having a proper database to monitor the progress in terms of delivery system and targeting system. I will now pose some questions to our speakers, and then we come from the questions from these audiences. So a lot of issues, I think, came up, and we see that there are a lot of differences in terms of how countries are responding to this crisis, even in situations where we see that a lot of cases are happening. In some places we see that a lot of testing and other capacity buildings are happening, and protecting the poor people also requires that this health system also respond to this problem. But in many countries, we did not see that has developed even during this situation. So in terms of the protection, the social protection system needs also probably to think about how we actually think about the health system in these developing countries. So if I can come with some thoughts from you, I start with Mihail about how the social protection system can be designed so that our health systems are better prepared and can be, we can hopefully protect from next pandemic.
Thank you very much, Asad. I would point to two aspects of that relationship between social protection and health systems. The first aspect is that we need to make sure that social safety net provided to the people leads to improvements in health behavior. And by that I mean regular health checkups for children and for adults and care about health. And this is why so many cash transfers program worldwide are conditional. And one of the conditions is typically to make sure that the recipients are in touch with health services. And then there is an increasing body of evidence showing that with the proper information campaign, you don't need to make those programs conditional, but you need to make it widely known that this is an expected behavior in receipt of the transfer. And that is also the evidence is it's actually working better than expected. So this is one thing I would like to highlight, the public health behavior consequences of receiving cash transfers. As an externality in a way of that and behavioral nudges related to that. The second thing I wanted to highlight is as follows. In my presentation, I alluded to the fact that those who are the most hit by COVID crisis, which are primarily people in the urban informal sector, need to receive not only social assistance in the form of social safety nets, what I talked about primarily, but they also should be able to receive social insurance. And social insurance against various risks of their lives. And this system needs to be a very innovative system. It cannot replicate the system that is for state-owned enterprises in African countries when 10% is formal, because it's rigid, it's obsolete, it's payroll tax based, it has all kinds of drawbacks. It needs to be mobile money based, it needs to be voluntary, it needs to allow for immediate withdrawals, and it needs to have behavioral nudges. And one of the biggest behavioral nudges, which I find in the informal sector worldwide, is actually bundling health insurance and insurance against other risks, such as old age, incapacity, or disability. So we need a lot of work to be done along the lines of bringing health, pensions, disability together into a bundle that would be offered voluntarily to informal sector folks with proper behavioral nudges and very modern mobile money-based delivery. And I think this is a big promise to have the most vulnerable to COVID-like crises population, urban informal sector, to be better prepared for the next crisis to hit. Thanks very much, Asad. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Michael. It's interesting that you mentioned about this information campaign. So we did a information campaign in our city in Bangladesh during this COVID-19. And what we find that when we give information to people and discuss about the protective measures, if people are given the information rightly, they adhere to the compliance issue and they are better protected. So it seems that there is a lot of behavioral issues that nudges and other things that you mentioned. We need to develop the system information, and the traditional mechanism that what we saw is like the text messaging and other system. It worked to a certain extent, but it didn't go beyond that because you needed to people push a bit in terms of nudging their behavior, changing their behavior. So that was the thing that we observed, and we found that this has a large effects in both India and in Bangladesh. It's a larger scale experiment. So we just have the paper out there. And so if I can draw attention to Celia about this health insurance aspect that Michael mentioned. So in the context of Philippines, what do you think that what are the things that the country has achieved in this situation to address the pandemic and what can be done more?
Yeah, our universal health insurance program is relatively young, just a few years ago. So we're still trying to establish it. And right now, the status is that we're trying to provide coverage to everyone, but the benefits are very low. So I think that's the major challenge. It doesn't provide all the benefits that we would want to, even just the minimum. So for instance, for testing and treatment of COVID, that's not available to everyone at this time. And so that's something that we need to work on, as Michael mentioned earlier, we need to think of not just the free provision, but to put together all of these different components so you have a sustainable health insurance program. But I think another challenge in the case of the Philippines is that health services is devolved, and I think this is might also be true for other countries as well. So the challenge of harmonizing or coordinating the efforts of both national and local governments to ensure that their health system is adequate to respond to a pandemic such as what we're seeing here. What we found was that we lacked investments in the health system, and so we had to cope with meager resources to be able to address this. In addition, the disparities across locations is something that needs to be looked at more, not just in terms of facilities, but also in terms of manpower. So there's still a lot of work to be done in ensuring that the health system can cope. And I think also another challenge, which technology can also possibly address, is that many people avoided going to hospitals because of the fear of COVID. They did not seek treatment for non-COVID related diseases. And so perhaps wider adoption of technology to deal with non-COVID cases would have helped. And we don't want to see that farther down the line, there would be a resurgence of some other cases that were left untreated during this time of the pandemic.
Good. This adoption of technology is changing the world, and in developing countries is expanding rapidly. And I can say that people in the villages are also receiving a lot of information through the technology. So if I can draw the attention to you, Darno, you have done a lot of work on targeting transfer system, and you have a recent paper, and you also mentioned about work by Ben Olken and Remahana that says that in developing countries, maybe we need to think more about targeting system to transfer rather than probably say universal basic income or other things. But in this time of crisis, targeting is also very difficult if you don't have already built-in system. So based on what you see in the case of Indonesia and your experience working, and also considering the situation that the pandemic has also created a new poor, so those who were not poor initially to begin with, and how do we actually target this kind of new poor people even when you have the system in built?
Exactly, that's a good point, Professor Asad. That's why we have a mixed targeting algorithm. As you know, that we cover everyone in the social registry of the bottom 40%, all of the social system. But we knew exactly that this also affects everybody. And we know that data is outdated, so we have to also include the new poor. How can we capture this new poor? That's why, in addition to using this already social registry, we also introduced this so-called village cash transfer. So the rule is for those who did not receive program from central government using the social registry, they have to receive this social assistance through the village fund. And we also, secondly, we also have this so-called on-demand application from the pre-employment card. So another rule is this is actually middle class, urbanized, educated, but they are got laid off. So they can apply for that job, not job actually as a training, but the incentive for doing training as a part of social systems are actually quite significant and very helpful for them during the pandemic. So we understood very well about this issue of outdated data, exclusion, inclusion error. I saw the question from Professor Kudadak also. He's also expert in this targeting mechanics. That's why in our final presentation is that, yes, targeting is important because it's also politically easy to convince to the public and also to the parliament, not giving money to everyone because we have a limited fiscal space. So we have to give the money to the most in need. But we understand about the complication of this one. So that's why we have to have this mechanic, updated mechanic that will be kicking out the people who already graduated and bringing in new people who are poor in the system, using a big data, using on-demand application. That's what we have been developing for the last 3 years. Hopefully it will be continue implemented, including the CPMS that Dr. Celia already mentioned. And by the way, we have been in the same network for the last 20 years since the crisis in 98. Actually, the first time I met Celia was in Paris in 98 during the Asian financial crisis. So this is like, here we go again, having another crisis globally. So basically, this is based on the experience we developed with the World Bank, with ADB for the last 20 years about the limitation, but also politically and also political economy type is implementable. That's Asad. That's a good point, but we admitted that. So we would like to allow people to register if they are not excluded, if they are not receiving the social system. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can draw attention to you, Michal, a big picture issue. So a lot of countries are expanding the social protection system and also spending a lot of money on protecting people. But this also raises the concern, the big issue like the fiscal burden, how countries will pay of this debt. And I can see also many governments are also concerned, and that's why you see even with the level of cases spreading around in many countries, some governments are a bit conservative in terms of taking measures on social protection and other issues. So in terms of the fiscal space, so this raises a concern that whether this will create an unsustainable burden for the countries, and also for countries like in Asia, are there any prospects that we will be facing a debt crisis? I come from country Bangladesh, where we see that steps are taken, but not really in that right direction because because in terms of the fiscal space, there are still a scope, but we see the government did not take that much to protect the poor people. So, what do you think in terms of what is it a big concern that we should not really really spend too much on this kind of measures, or maybe a bit more cautious? What would be the World Bank's kind of policy in this kind of scenario?
Thank you very much, Asad. Let me distinguish for the purpose of that academic conference by the Monash University between the World Bank view and my own ideas. On the World Bank, you may know that we are championing an initiative on the debt transparency, and we would like countries to benefit from the debt, from the ability to increase the debt to pay for the COVID response, as long as it is done in a transparent way and in which the debts are properly reported. And this is an important initiative, and I think the transparency in debt management is critical for the ability of the countries to deal with COVID in a way that is acceptable worldwide, therefore allow for a higher level of debt. So this is what I wanted to say. The second thing what I wanted to say, also in a way speaking for the World Bank, is that there is a lot of room, and I think we alluded to that in our World Development Report on the changing nature of work, World Development Report 2019, in which we talked about the taxation of international platforms, and the need to really improve the taxation of those because there is a lot of evasion going on in the process, and we supported our OECD colleagues and our G20 colleagues in the agenda of BEPS, which is base erosion and profit shifting, how to deal with that in order to increase the pool of resources that could be directed towards social uses including social protection measures, and including, as you just discussed with Sudarno and Celia, well-targeted social protection measures. My last point on that, and this is the point which I'd like to single out as really not the World Bank point, but this is more of a reflective point of somebody who has worked as an economist for many years and has also been interested in economic history, which is that, you know, one of the biggest limitations which I think we have when we talk about financing is that we are limited to flows, meaning we talk about incomes, we report Gini incomes, inequality of incomes, and then we know what ranges are there, like 0.35, 0.4, 0.5, then we have Brazil on the high end. But I think what we need to do collectively as economists, it's not my call for international organizations to do it, because that is a complicated, probably, politics behind it, but it's to look at assets. And Gini assets would be much higher than Gini incomes in the 0.8, 0.85. So I frankly, if we cast the problem the following way, the COVID crisis calls on us to look at inequalities in the world and ability to cope with further crises, then I don't think the really meaningful answer could be received without looking at the inequality of assets and subsequently on the way in which this inequality of assets could be reduced. And here we go into a very complicated world of inheritance taxation, asset taxation, and others. But I think inevitably we are going this way because COVID crisis exposes how uneven and unequal we are in our capacity to deal with COVID consequences. So the call for more equality is there, is needed there, and it is hard to respond meaningfully to it, even with base erosion and profit shifting, even with transparency of taxes without looking at the assets inequality. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So you raised an important issue about asset inequality and possibility of some sort of taxation to reduce that inequality, and is it kind of one-off asset taxation, or is it something that you are proposing that we should have it in the system?
Yeah, no, I don't have any proposals. I'm raising an issue which is very seldom discussed, and I don't think many institutions are ready to discuss it. I am just raising an item which I think in the future will be discussed much more than it has been so far.
I mean, during this pandemic, we also know that there's some of these digital companies, for example, Amazon and others, they have built up so much profit as well, taking opportunity of this online system. So, and is there any scope that we can think about these big companies that are profiting during this pandemic because of this situation and that evolved? We should have some more taxation on this kind of companies as well?
I leave it for my colleague panelists to react. I think the answer is yes. And I think that in here, as I mentioned before, I am among very few non-Asian participants, but I think European Commission has made a big progress in trying to call on Google, on Amazon, and on other companies to actually be taxed properly given the income they have. I would personally think a bigger global effort, perhaps UN effort, perhaps with the World Bank, would be needed here. But I noticed that at least European Union is a global institution, although continental only. But still, if joined by other regional groupings, then it might be very, very helpful, because I think it's a very healthy call on taxing global platforms for the benefit of social programs.
I'll not go to Celia to raise the issue that the gender, about the gender. This COVID-19 also exposed an issue that the gender division in terms of taking responsibility at home or going back to job after the situation gets better. And we observed that women are more likely to suffer due to this kind of situation. Even you raised the issue about the education in Philippines. Good we saw that public schools are still open, but still private schools were closed. So women needed to take more responsibility at home to look after their children and other issues. So the big question is, when we are thinking about the social protection system, we need to also probably think about the gender dimension of it. So from the policy context, in terms of the things that is happening in Philippines and other countries, what do you see how the government should respond in terms of the gender issues and protecting the women's jobs, women's food security, and even their education as well?
Yeah, I think during these times there have been added burden on the parents, not just the mothers, in terms of assisting their children in online education, and this is something that many of the parents are not equipped with. But more especially the women, because they do the other task at home. I'm sure some of the fathers would object that they also do their share, but mainly, well, at least in the Philippines, a lot of women do majority of the tasks. So that puts added burden on the women. And also there have been reports of more cases of domestic violence because people are staying at home in very small spaces, and everybody's there. And so there are more cases of domestic violence. So this is something that we need to take into account. Similarly with other disasters like typhoons, when you put women and children in evacuation centers, you need to contend with some of their specific needs as well. So gender has to be factored in. The gender dimension has to be factored in some of the social protection programs. And I'd also like to point out that perhaps because women may be more involved in informal sector activities, so they could have been more affected by these lockdowns. But they have also been resourceful in terms of engaging in online selling. So I don't know in the other countries, but in the case of the Philippines, everybody has been engaged in selling food online. And so that has been a way of coping with this. But on a more macro level, I think this is in addition to what Michael has mentioned about digital taxation issues. I think we also need to look more closely at work in the digital platforms, and because that provides opportunities for women to engage, because they have chunks of time to get engaged in platform work, in online work, but at the same time also there's less social protection that's being afforded for those working in that kind of employment.
Thank you. We are near to our time. Yes, this is an important issue that changing the lives of the women even through the digital transformation and the gender-based violence that have evolved during this crisis. And we are organizing our next webinar on this gender-based violence on 1st of December. So hopefully I will see many of you here joining. So with this, I would like to conclude here now on behalf of CDS. Thank you, our speakers, and thank you all the participants for joining us. I hope you all stay safe and sound, and we'll see you in our next webinar on 1st of December.